For years, the Suez Canal had seemed to sit under a spell of waiting. Soldiers watched each other from opposite banks, patrols moved through heat and dust, and the water lay between the armies like a challenge neither side had yet answered. Then, on the 6th of October, 1973, the stillness broke with a force that seemed to tear open the whole frontier at once. Egyptian guns thundered along the West Bank, shells crashed into Israeli positions, and assault boats moved toward the canal under a sky darkened by smoke. Operation Badr was the moment Egypt turned planning into motion. It was the surprise crossing that shattered Israeli assumptions, restored Egyptian confidence, and changed the Yom Kippur War from a crisis Israel expected to manage into a battlefield emergency it had not truly imagined. If you would like to move beyond the podcast, you can see my available books at militaryauthor.me. And at trackpads.com, you will find magazines and galleries with hundreds of thousands of photos and videos to explore.
The timing was chosen with care. In Israel, it was Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, when roads were quiet, many soldiers were at home, and the ordinary rhythm of the country slowed almost to silence. In Egypt, the date fell during Ramadan, which helped mask preparations and added its own layer of discipline and endurance to the forces waiting near the canal. Surprise was not absolute in the sense that no one saw danger coming. Warning signs existed, and Israeli intelligence had watched Egyptian exercises before. The deeper surprise lay in disbelief. Many Israeli decision-makers still doubted that Egypt would launch a war it could not win in the old, sweeping sense. Sadat's limited aim had hidden in plain sight because it did not match what his opponents expected ambition to look like.
Before the first boats touched the water, Egypt prepared the battlefield with fire. Artillery batteries, mortars, and rockets struck Israeli strongpoints, observation posts, command facilities, and routes leading toward the front. The barrage was not simply noise meant to frighten men in bunkers. It was part of a carefully timed effort to blind, isolate, and disorient the defenders during the crossing's most fragile minutes. Israeli soldiers in the Bar-Lev Line found themselves under intense bombardment while Egyptian infantry gathered at the water's edge. In a canal crossing, minutes matter more than almost anything. If defenders can organize quickly and hit the assault waves while they are still in boats, the attack can die in the water. Egypt's opening fire was meant to buy those minutes with steel. Then came the assault troops. Egyptian infantry moved in small craft across a waterway that had dominated military planning for 6 years. They were not crossing as a mob carried forward by emotion, but as men assigned to rehearsed tasks: reach the far bank, climb, clear, mark, dig, and hold. Some went toward Israeli strongpoints. Others pushed inland to form the first defensive positions east of the canal. The first wave mattered because it had to survive before tanks, heavy weapons, and bridges could make the crossing permanent. For the soldiers in the boats, strategy narrowed into physical facts: the slap of water against the hull, the weight of equipment, the far bank rising ahead, and the knowledge that every delay made them more vulnerable. A national plan had become a few exposed yards of water. What made Operation Badr so remarkable was not that Egyptian troops crossed the canal. Armies had forced rivers before. What mattered was the scale and coordination of the crossing against an enemy famous for speed of response. Egyptian planners had divided the operation into sequences in which infantry, engineers, artillery, air defense, and armor all depended on one another. The infantry seized the first footholds. Engineers worked to open passages through the sand rampart. Anti-tank teams moved forward with weapons intended to meet the Israeli armored reserves when they arrived. Air defense units on the West Bank helped create a protective zone over the canal area. Every part of this system had a job, and the success of one part gave the next part room to act. This was combined arms warfare built around a water obstacle. The Israeli forward positions were suddenly in a nightmare version of the war they had expected. The Bar-Lev strongpoints had been designed to warn, delay, and help anchor the defense until armored reserves could counterattack. But the Egyptian assault was too broad, too forceful, and too well prepared for the line to function as Israeli assumptions required. Some Israeli soldiers fought from bunkers and fortified posts, while Egyptian troops moved around them, cutting them off from easy relief. Others tried to observe and report through the chaos of shell fire and disrupted communications. These strong points were not imaginary, and many defenders fought stubbornly. Yet their predicament revealed the weakness of any forward defense that depends on time, when the enemy's whole plan is designed to steal time away. The first Israeli instinct was to reach for the familiar remedy: armor. Tanks had saved bad situations before, and the Sinai desert seemed to promise the same answer again. Israeli crews began moving toward the canal in scattered counterattacks, often without a full picture of the Egyptian bridgeheads forming ahead of them. What they met was not a confused enemy waiting to be rolled up. Egyptian infantry had crossed with anti-tank weapons, including missiles and rockets that could punish tanks approaching without careful infantry and artillery support. The psychological shock was severe. A tank crew trained for mobile desert fighting could suddenly find itself targeted from low, hard-to-see positions near the canal. The machine that had symbolized Israeli battlefield recovery in 1967 was now entering ground prepared specifically to stop it. The Egyptian air defense system was equally important because it changed the relationship between tanks and aircraft. In 1967, Israeli air power had been devastating, and many Israeli soldiers expected that aircraft would help break any major Egyptian move. But by 1973, Egypt had built a dense missile shield along the canal front. Surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft guns made it dangerous for Israeli aircraft to operate freely over the crossing area. This did not mean the Israeli Air Force disappeared, and it did not mean Egyptian troops were invulnerable from the air. It meant the easy assumption of air rescue no longer applied. For armored warfare, that mattered enormously. Tanks advancing without air cover are more exposed. Infantry holding bridgeheads under missile protection becomes more resilient. The sky itself had become part of Egypt's defensive plan. As the day unfolded, the crossing began to take on the shape Egyptian planners had hoped for. Assault waves expanded the bridgeheads. Engineers worked at the sand wall. Ferries and bridging equipment moved toward the canal. Tanks and heavier weapons waited for their turn to cross, while infantry dug in to meet the counterattacks everyone knew would come. The battlefield was loud, crowded, and dangerous. But it was not random. Egyptian success came from years of reducing an almost impossible problem into repeatable actions. The crossing did not rely on one heroic gesture. It relied on thousands of soldiers doing practiced things under fire. That is why Operation Badr remains one of the most important opening operations in the history of modern Middle Eastern warfare. It proved that careful method could overturn a powerful enemy's expectations. On the Israeli side, confusion spread upward from the canal toward headquarters. Reports came in from strongpoints under attack, from tank units meeting unexpected resistance, and from commanders trying to understand the scale of the crossing. The disaster was not simply that Egyptian soldiers had reached the East Bank. It was that they had done so in strength and were not collapsing. Israeli leaders had to confront the possibility that the old pattern had broken. Mobilization would bring reserves, and Israel's capacity for recovery was still formidable. But the first hours of a war can shape everything that follows. Roads become clogged, assumptions harden or shatter, and commanders make decisions while the picture is still incomplete. Operation Badr placed Israel in exactly that position, forced to react before it fully understood the new battlefield. For Egypt, the emotional meaning of the day was immense. Since 1967, the canal had been a symbol of loss, but now Egyptian soldiers stood on the East Bank again. That fact carried power beyond the number of miles gained. It mattered to the army, to the government, and to a public that had lived with the memory of defeat. Yet it would be wrong to describe the crossing as mere symbolism. The bridgeheads were military realities, defended by infantry, anti-tank weapons, artillery support, and the missile umbrella. They gave Egypt a foothold from which to absorb Israeli counterblows and claim the political effect Sadat wanted. Still, success brought danger. Once an operation works, leaders can be tempted to ask for more from it than it was built to deliver. The strength of Operation Badr lay in its limits. That limit is essential to understanding what came next. Egyptian forces were most dangerous while they remained near the canal, inside the defensive system designed to protect them. Their anti-tank teams, artillery, and air defense coverage created conditions in which Israeli counterattacks could be badly hurt. But farther east, deeper into Sinai, the balance would begin to change. Tanks would need more fuel, more maintenance, more coordination, and more protection from aircraft and flanking movement. The opening success of Operation Badr did not mean Egypt had solved every problem of desert warfare. It meant Egypt had solved the first problem brilliantly. The canal had been crossed, the Bar-Lev Line had been compromised, and Israeli armor had been forced to fight on terms chosen by someone else.
Operation Badr deserves its place in the story of armored warfare because it reminds us that tanks do not define a battle simply by being present. In this opening act, the most decisive forces were often the ones that made tanks possible or made tanks vulnerable. Engineers cutting through sand, infantry carrying anti-tank weapons, artillery suppressing strongpoints, missile crews guarding the sky, and commanders who understood the importance of timing. The episode also marks a shift from the sweeping myth of the armored charge toward the colder reality of modern combined arms battle. A tank could still be terrifying, mobile, and decisive, but only if it entered the right fight at the right moment with the right support. On the 6th of October, Egypt made sure that the first Israeli tanks entered the wrong fight. By nightfall, the canal was no longer the frontier Israel had trusted and Egypt had mourned. It had become a bridge, a wound, and a doorway. Egyptian soldiers held ground in Sinai. Israeli strongpoints were isolated or under desperate pressure, and the first counterattacks had failed to restore the old order. The war was only beginning, and Israel would recover from the shock with a ferocity that would later carry its forces back across the canal in the opposite direction. But the opening blow had done what Sadat needed it to do. It shattered the frozen confidence left by 1967 and proved that Egypt could plan, strike, and endure. Operation Badr was not the end of the story. It was the moment the waterline broke, and with it the belief that the next war would look like the last.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.